The topic, as you can see, heritable human genome editing, science, ethics, and the art of policymaking, is very broad. And so I give you fair warning, this will be a whirlwind tour. I apologize for the whiplash, not only in terms of the speed and the scope of material I hope to cover, but also the transition from really some basic science to some really big picture ideas about what's the goal of the science, where might it take us. So to be clear at the outset, this presentation is on germline genome modification. So we're making changes or imagining making changes to the gametes, the gamete precursor cells, the early human embryo for reproductive purposes. On the assumption that many of you are not used to listening to a philosopher speak, I thought it'd be helpful if I just gave you a brief outline. What I'm going to try to do today is introduce the concept of slow science and emphasize the importance of reflecting on the social value of science. Next, I'm going to introduce you to the concept of broad societal consensus, a contentious topic to say the least. I then want to explain the call for a moratorium as part of an effort to create the background conditions for slow science and for consensus building. I'll then provide some information about the background context for the consensus building. And I'm going to end by commenting on the ways in which scientists can and have contributed to discussion and debate. So one of the things I want you to think about is this notion of slow science. This is a manifesto that was actually published in 2010 by a group of German academics. Permit me a little bit of karaoke. Their concern was that today's research environment pushes for the quick fix, but successful science needs time to think, time to read, time to digest. Less time filling out forms, chasing elusive grant money, shoveling out papers, so that there's time to mull over the big questions. And it's a recognition that science develops unsteadily with jerky moves and unpredictable leaps forward. Major findings can come after a number of false starts. At the same time, science creeps about on a very slow timescale, for which there must be room. So you'll appreciate here that slow science is being proposed almost as an antidote to fast science. The concern is about the focus on numbers, numbers of publications, numbers of grant dollars, numbers of patents, numbers of pages in a CV. The worry is that everything is being done so quickly to push up the numbers, specifically numbers around publications, and that this great rush maybe ends up with a lot of stuff that's not particularly edifying. A fancy way of saying we're concerned about the problem of quantity over quality. So as I said, slow science is being proposed as an antidote to fast science through the generation of fast facts. And for some of you, you'll appreciate that slow science in some ways is modeled on the ideas around the slow food movement. So for me, the big questions are of this kind. What kind of world do you want to live in? And in this context, what I think becomes really important is the worry that many people have that science is no longer about knowledge, but about the knowledge economy. That there's such a focus on delivering tangible, measurable widgets, numbers, things. Why? Because that's understood to somehow be a contribution to a resilient and prosperous economy. But the worry about that is that scientists aren't actually contributing in a meaningful way to developing the research agenda. They're contributing to a research enterprise that's being driven by other kinds of interests. The last image you have on the slide there is of Alice in Wonderland. She comes to a fork in the road and she asks the Cheshire cat in the tree, which road do I take? The cat responds, well, where do you want to go? And Alice says, well, I don't know. And then the response is, well, it really hardly matters which way you go. So part of what the slow science movement is about is asking you to take the time to answer the why question. Why are you doing this science? Not how. And therefore, if you look at the why question, the hope is that you're going to come up with a better answer than just because you can. One of the things that happens if you haven't got an answer to the why question is you end up with science and technology that ultimately becomes a solution in search of a problem, which is partly how some people, including myself, sometimes see some of the science specifically around heritable human genome editing. Why? Well, one of the things that's important is when you ask the question, why are we doing this research? The most common answer, and sometimes the only answer to the why question, is there are couples out there who are at risk of having a genetic disease. They want to have genetically related children that are healthy. And for them, there are no other options, or if there are options, they're options that they don't want. And these are generally couples with no unaffected embryos available to them for transfer. And examples commonly given are Huntington's disease and cystic fibrosis. Now, let me illustrate for you the need in relation to cystic fibrosis. So the need in this case is, okay, if this is something we want to respond to, how many couples are we talking about? I want you to pay attention to the last line. One case every 15 years. Now, I grant you globally the numbers will be higher, but not much. And the thing for you to appreciate is that this is one of the diseases in what's described as category A in the report just released by the International Commission looking at the translational pathway forward for this science. And so one of the questions someone like myself will ask is this a good use of time, talent, and treasure? The point there is to ask people to reflect on what are the opportunity costs if this becomes the focus of the work. So that's the first point where I want to just say, okay, reality check. What's the priority? What's the answer to the why question? Is it a good answer? Is it a motivating answer? Let me transition now to the second concept I wanted to talk about, which is broad societal consensus. The first International Summit on Human Genome Editing was held in 2015 in Washington. At the end of that meeting, a statement was released by the organizing committee, conflict of interest. I was a member of the organizing committee. And at the end of that meeting, we issued a statement where we made two claims. And if you think about it, the first claim, which says you have to have at least some information so that you can answer questions about safety and efficacy, is really addressing some of the how of the question. The second criterion, that there had to be broad societal consensus, was in some way addressing the question about the why. And is there an interest on the part of the world to see this as a priority that should be aggressively pursued, funded, encouraged? In that context, one of the things I want to say very clearly is that this is the first time this particular phrase, broad societal consensus, gets introduced into the discussion or debate around human genome editing. Its appearance is extremely brief. Why? Because immediately afterwards, that notion, that concept, if you will, is disappeared. We don't hear about it again. So in 2015, you have a situation whereby there's the first international summit. The committee issues a comment. Such research involving heritable human genome editing should not proceed until two conditions are met: safety and efficacy, broad societal consensus. The next major initiative is this publication by NASEM, the National Academy of Science, Engineering, and Medicine in the United States in 2017. They were not bound by anything that was said at that meeting, and they come up with a different position. And what's important is that they focus on the science. They make no mention of broad societal consensus. Not to say it's a good idea, a bad idea, just silent, no mention. If you look at the next major report to come out, it comes out of the United Kingdom. It's the Nuffield Council report in 2018. And there, what's interesting is that they do actually engage with the idea of broad societal consensus, but very quickly set it aside and say what's important is broad societal debate. So I'm interested to know, how do you know when the debate's over if the goal is not consensus? What's the point of the debate? And when do we know that we've debated it enough? And then what happens, which is quite interesting, is in 2018, we have another situation, at the second international summit, we have another situation whereby the science is moving ahead at a radically unexpected pace, shall we say. And after this, at this meeting, again, no mention of broad societal consensus. And the most recent report to have come out, September 2020, is by the International Commission, which was looking again at the issue of a translational pathway forward. And interestingly, the word consensus appears again, but I'm going to show you in a minute how it appears in a very odd way. There is one more report, which I had hoped would be available for today's conversation. It's not yet in the public domain. It's the World Health Organization had a committee also looking at heritable human genome editing, and it's now expected that report will be out in the next 2 weeks. Again, statement conflict of interest. I was a member of the WHO committee, and that report, as I said, should be available. I encourage you to look for it if you have any interest in these kinds of questions. Now, I did say the last report does mention broad consensus. And what's interesting is two things. First of all, the swapping out of the word societal for international, because there's really has been since 2015 this constant effort to distance any subsequent conversation from this idea of broad societal consensus. And so this is the only mention. It's in the foreword, so it's not actually part of the report per se. But what I think is important is, and I'm going to read it out as the sentence, this event, the birth of the CRISPR babies prior to the previous international summit, made clear the absence of broad societal consensus regarding both the societal acceptability of particular applications and also the relevant scientific evidence. So what are they saying? Something happened. CRISPR babies were born, and what that tells us is the absence of broad societal consensus. Now, what's interesting is that that could have been written completely differently, and to make the same point, it could have been said, this event made it clear that there is broad international consensus regarding the societal unacceptability of particular applications and the absence of scientific evidence. I'm a philosopher by training. We pay attention to words. And one of the things that's important here is to understand we're making a claim that there isn't a consensus when we could just as easily have said there is a consensus and it maps out in this way. The last report I want to show you actually just came out last week. It's issued by the Stem Cell Committee, the ISSCR. And one of the things that's absolutely interesting here is that although human genome editing is not stem cell research, they addressed this issue. And they addressed it in 2016. And interestingly, in 2016, those guidelines say that this type of research in which human embryos have undergone a genetic modification and are going to be implanted and gestated in a human or an animal, is prohibited. And it's prohibited. Why? I quote, because of broad international consensus. But that was 2016. And last week in 2021, that statement has been completely erased. And so there's no longer any reference to human genome editing not being supported in terms of a broad international consensus that there's concern about this. Instead, the statement simply says it's currently unsafe or it raises unresolved ethical issues. So one of the things I find quite interesting is all of this tension around this language of broad societal consensus. Why? I'm going to suggest this because there's an unwillingness or an inability to hold oneself accountable to society. And that's the difference between broad societal consensus versus broad international consensus. Or at least that's what I'm prepared to defend. So again, gene editing reality check. What's at issue around the language? I'm going to go through this very quickly, and I apologize for that, but I have a whole chapter in my book where I really unpack this idea of consensus. And one of the things that I want to say is that my work is very much founded on work that was done by feminist activists in the early 1980s. They were camped out near the Seneca Army Depot in the United States. They were protesting the deployment of Cruise and Pershing II nuclear missiles to Europe. And in that context, they needed collaborative decision-making because they had women from around the country that had come here to protest that had not much in common except their objection to the deployment of these missiles. And what they do is they come up with rules of engagement, ways in which we're going to be able to have respectful dialogue and come to a consensus position. And I'm just going to put these up here for you very quickly and then summarize, but I will be inviting you to have a look more closely at what consensus building is about. It's about building trust. It's about having respect for the views and values of others. It's about accepting responsibility for your participation, your contribution to dialogue, debate. The principles here in this work are responsibility, self-discipline, respect, cooperation, and struggle. I can hardly imagine anybody would disagree with those views and values. In terms of my own work, and this is just some of the examples, and I'm sure you can find them on the web if you're at all interested in this idea of consensus building. The things that I've added to this is I've added bookends in terms of a commitment to inclusivity, which is about who gets to be part of this conversation, and benevolence. And the reason for benevolence is not everybody's going to get everything they thought they wanted when they came into the conversation. And we need to show kindness and caring towards those who will, in fact, leave a consensus building scenario without having had things resolved in the way that they thought. Now, you might be wondering, how can you say that if it's all about consensus? Doesn't that mean everybody agreed? No, that's one of the key things that I explore and explain over time. Consensus doesn't mean unanimity. It doesn't mean unanimity. It means unity. And what I think is really important there is that what we're trying to say is that the claim is that all the ideas were considered legitimate. They were all out on the table for consideration. But it doesn't mean that everybody got what they wanted. And I think any of you who really participate in any kind of a consensus building exercise, if you do that in good faith, you know what it means as shifts happen. I want to put this in context for you to show you that we have not been working towards consensus. And I actually think that that's been a purposeful choice not to even try, because some people hold the belief that it's not possible, therefore, why bother? Very quickly, in 2015, there was the International Summit. That committee came out with a very strong statement. It would be irresponsible to proceed with any clinical use of genome editing unless and until, and I already spoke about those conditions. The NASEM report comes out 2 years later, and we see almost an about face. Clinical trials using heritable germline genome editing should be permitted, provided that, and the list goes on. 2018, we have the second International Summit, and now we're told it's time to define a rigorous, responsible translational pathway forward. 2019, you get the call for a global moratorium. Why? Because we're not moving towards consensus building. One of the things that's important about understanding the call for a moratorium is to allow for slow science, it's to allow for the building of consensus. And so it's not about a permanent ban, it's about creating a space for a conversation to take place. And one of the things that's really important, and it allows me to make the point, is at the time we said that there's about 30 nations that currently have legislation that either directly or indirectly bans this. And so we weren't sure, do we have a consensus? The thing is, that number turns out to be very wrong. We did a survey published last fall, managed to look at almost half the world's countries and found that 75 out of 96 explicitly prohibit this. Don't you think that might be the beginning of actually having a conversation about whether that's a consensus we want to maintain or consensus we want to disrupt? But how do you say you don't have the beginnings of a consensus? The last point about reality check. And I'm now going to just very quickly talk you through the idealized role for scientists. And I'm going to reach a little bit into the question time, but I think it's really important. In my book, I have a whole chapter on this where I try to say there are at least 4 kinds of caricatures, if you will. There's no one scientist that fits neatly into any one of these descriptions. But I think what's really important here is to appreciate that each one of them has something that they're trying to communicate. So you have the pure scientist. This is somebody who's just generating information. It's science for the sake of science. You have the science analyst who, yes, generates information, but on top of that is trying to help the broader public understand, and so will assist with interpretation. You have the science advocate who's taking one step further, not only generating information, assisting with interpretation, but also staking out a position, advocating for a very specific policy option. And then you have the science diplomat who's trying to assist and promote collective decision-making. So very quickly, what you're looking at is a scientist who chooses to stay on the periphery of policymaking, a scientist who wants to engage by helping decision makers better interpret the data, a scientist who wants to advocate for a particular set of interests, a scientist who wants to enrich and perhaps eliminate certain policy options in order to make it possible for there to be compromise. I'm going to end with just a few images and ask you to think about these scientists and how you think they might fit along that spectrum. We have here Francisco Mojica, Francis Collins, Robin Lovell Badge, Jennifer Doudna. I'm sure they're all known to you. We have here Josiah Zayner, a biohacker, David Baltimore, who chaired both the first and second summits, Shukrat Metalipov, George Church. Again, I'm sure they're familiar to you. Emmanuel Charpentier, Feng Zhang, Fyodor Urnov, Janet Rosant, and I could go on. The point is, these are all people who are active scientists in this domain. How is it that they choose to contribute to policymaking? I want to end with a final teaser. I started at the beginning with the story of Alice in Wonderland. You're at a fork in the road. You want to know where to go, where to take your science. What's the next interesting question? You need to answer the why question. I think the biggest, most interesting why question is, what kind of world do you want to live in? And how does your science contribute to help building that world? In my book, Altered Inheritance, which for those of you who stick around from the panel will get a chance to talk about, I worry that the world we're building right now is narrowly focused on power, wealth, competition, inequality, and exclusion. The book is a call to action. It's an invitation to imagine a different kind of world and then to think back about what those contributions will be, not only to the science, but to the policymaking, to the broader environment in which that science gets uptake and gets used to build a better world. Thank you.